Sri Aurobindo is describing the true sense of renunciation in the integral yoga, and we have seen that it is not a renunciation of the world. Renunciation is for us only an instrument, a means by which we remove whatever opposes the divine self-fulfillment, and a means by which we progressively leave aside all partial and inferior realizations. This being the object, Sri Aurobindo now describes how this inner psychological renunciation has three components. There is a renunciation of attachment and craving of desire in the senses and the heart. There is the renunciation of attachment and craving of self-will in the thought and action. And finally, there is the renunciation of attachment and craving in the egoism in the center of the consciousness. These are the three knots, he says, by which we are bound to our lower nature. And if we can renounce these utterly, then there is nothing which can bind us. We have already discussed the first two, where regarding the renunciation of attachment and craving of desire in the senses, he describes how it is not, in effect, a dryness that is to be created. We will experience love, we will experience delight, but the nature of that love and delight are different, and we have discussed that. Similarly, we completed last time the description of renunciation of self-will in thought and action. And we saw how Sri Aurobindo describes with a skillful image how this self-will, egoism in the mind, attaches itself to preferences and habits and past formations, and it weaves around delicate threads of this I-ness in all these things and lives in the center like a spider in its web. And as a spider in the web, it is protective of the habits that it has, but at the same time, through the web by which it holds its own attachments, it becomes held by them, and the world holds it through those threads and makes it dance like a puppet. And Sri Aurobindo describes successively the various kinds of mental constructions, attachment to thought systems, religious dogmas, and even logical conclusions, which we have to cut and go beyond. And finally, he says, even to the truths which have been for us most secure, we must not attach to them. And we must always go further to the ineffable, who refuses to limit himself to any form or expression, keeping ourselves always open to a higher revelation and a higher vision in which all the opposites are included in that perspective. Now, as this description completes, it links beautifully into now the third. The third renunciation is the renunciation of the center of egoism in us. And the way by which that will be done will be precisely by a kind of a wideness of perspective. Rather than seeing the universe from the center of I, who am the center of the universe, to see the universe in itself, in the vastness, in the oneness of what it is, and then relate to the various centers equally from that large perspective. And so Sri Aurobindo always has this continuity, not only of ideas, but also of experience. And this last stage where he leaves us into this wideness that we have to get to is the base on which we will also get free of the attachment of the egoism. So this he now describes across, he describes in one paragraph and then elaborates with some very important examples. But the center of all resistance is egoism. And this we must pursue into every covert and disguise, and drag it out and slay it. For its disguises are endless, and it will cling to every shred of possible self-concealment. So in all that we have seen so far regarding the renunciation of attachment to craving of desire in the senses, self-will in thought and action, the crux of the problem always was the sense of I-ness and the sense of the self-importance that I give to my I-ness. And that's why he says it is the center of all resistance. In whatever you may do, in freeing yourself from any limitation, in overcoming any barrier, there is always the person who is trying to free from limitation, the person who is making an effort to overcome the barrier, the person who is making effort against all else. And somehow the point from which the effort seems to originate becomes more emphasized precisely because of the opposition that it has to overcome. Because the hurdle is great, I suddenly become more important. Because the pressure with which I have to push against the hurdle is now that much greater, and so I have to intensify or exaggerate my sense of self-importance. We notice how it takes on various forms in human psychology. Some people relish the being surrounded by problems and difficulties. Precisely for this reason, they feel important. If suddenly all the problems vanish, then you feel a little lost. Suddenly you have no meaning in the universe. You are no more the center of all the excitement. And so some little thing now needs to be grown and exaggerated until it becomes a large problem. And then you feel fulfilled. Yes, now I'm back into action. Although on another level you complain, oh, why is it I have problems? I seem to have more problems than others. But if we really observe behind the layers, something in me enjoys that exaggeration because it makes me feel important. I become the center and so on. And this is there in every human being. In some it is more exaggerated, in others it takes a different form. And so he says, we must pursue in all these variations of forms. He uses two images, pursue into every covert and disguise. So these are two forms in which the ego hides itself. The first word he uses, covert, is an unusual use, not common in language. We would normally use covert as an adjective. Here it is used as a noun, and it represents a hiding place. Pursue into every hiding place, because the ego hides inside any concealment that is possible. In particular, covert is used to describe a hiding place where an animal can hide. And now suddenly this image acquires a great, profound meaning. Pursue into every covert and disguise and drag it out and slay it. So when the ego, like a wild animal, hides in a niche where it is completely covered, wrapped as if by protection, we have to pursue into that hiding place, drag out the ego and slay it. So there are three steps in the elimination of the ego, or at least that form of the ego. To become aware even is a very big step. In most cases, when somebody points out a lack, an incapacity, or an error that we make, our first reaction, rather than even pausing to think, is it true? Did I actually do it? Was there If we were truly free of the need to cover up, we would pause and say, oh, I never thought of that, let me see. And we would explore, we would introspect. But we can't because it feels so uncomfortable. Something inside starts getting restless, even as the person is describing my lapse. And the more accurate the description, the more restless I seem to get. And I have to interrupt and justify. And this is a habit so deeply rooted in us, which prevents us from seeing. And so at first, one has to become very quiet and introspect and see. On the other hand, there are those in whom the introspection becomes obsessive. Where did I make a mistake? Where was I at fault? And then that becomes an aggrandizement for the ego. I have so many weaknesses. I'm completely incapable. What is this yoga? Can I actually do it? No, it's beyond me. And one goes on brooding over one sense of helplessness, which makes you feel great, important, center of the world. But in this form also, you will notice, although there is a form of introspection, it does not go to the crux. It stops at superficialities, looks for weaknesses to justify not making an effort. And if at that point somebody says, oh, but look, you have this capacity, you have done this before, you are fully capable. Oh, but you don't know how difficult it is for me. And I start focusing on my weaknesses and exaggerating them. So basically, there are the two different aspects of the same tendency that we struggle with. So the first step is to be able to become very quiet and honestly introspect. The word Mother uses always is sincerity. And the meaning she gives to it is to put all the parts of your being in alignment. That there is no part which is in contradiction to your central ideal or purpose or aspiration. And that means there can be nothing which covers or which hides. So sincerity, taken in its full sense, deepest sense, means you do not hide or deceive or cover up for yourself. Well, you start that introspection, you will discover parts which are covering and hiding, and of course you work gradually to bring them in line. And a very useful tool here is to remind ourselves that however skillfully we may fool ourselves, we rarely are able to fool others. People see through more easily than we can see ourselves. And so it doesn't make much sense to really try to fool yourself. And the second idea, which also helps, however much with skill I fool others, I cannot fool the divine. Because the divine is within me in those very parts which are concealing and those parts which are concealed. And the divine's awareness is fully awakened to everything happening because everything is made of his awareness. And so there is no need to even attempt to deceive. I have shared this story before and it is worth repeating here, how somebody had done something which was wrong, he should not have done, feeling himself guilty. He wanted to hide it from the mother when he had to go and meet her. So he concentrated, pushed the thought and the memory far behind, and then went to the mother with a very pretty, innocent, angelic appearance. And the mother greeted him as usual. So he came back from the meeting, successfully having deceived her, was relieved that she did not scold. And this went on for several weeks. Finally, he could not contain it. And the guilt began to pain too much, and he decided he had to confess. So he went to the mother and said, "Mother, I have to confess." And he narrated what it is he had done. But before he could say much, mother interrupted and said, "Oh, but I knew it from the very first day when you came. It was peeping out from behind you." But she was just as indulgent because that's the vision of the divine that sees the substance of humanity for what it is. And although we as individuals exaggerate the self importance, I am worse than others, or we go the other way, that person is far worse than anybody else, even far worse than me. The divine sees evenly. All human substance is part of the same substance of nature. And it is the beginning from which we have to build, develop something greater. This is the starting point of our evolution. And so, you have to accept it and move on. Wherever you are, whatever the internal difficulties, conflicts, contortions, problems that you have, from wherever you are, you move one step in the direction you want. There are people who are obsessed with making maps. I need to fully understand what is happening inside me. And then I will see what Sri Aurobindo says about that. And then I will fight and overcome that. And then when I'm perfect, then I will move forward. And of course, all that is quite a waste. In fact, one need not know where one is at all. If you're in the middle of a desert, you don't have your GPS, you don't have your maps, you have no indications. You see the rising sun. You know you have to move towards the sun. It does not matter where you are. You take a step in that direction. You need not know where your personal problems are. You need only know what is your aspiration, what is your goal, and just keep moving, plodding on. Even if it seems as if you slip and fall, does not matter how much you've slipped, how much you've fallen. It's all relative. In the infinity of things, nothing has changed. Move forward and keep doing that. And you know the direction. That's all that matters. So when we take an attitude like this, a lot of these problems tend to fade away. And we are able to face ourselves and deal with our own covert and disguises of self-deception and ego. So the first part is to be able to recognize and then to be able to enter into that part, drag it out and slay the ego. It sounds again very dramatic to be able to drag it out and slay. But if you think of the natural way in which one would do it, it would be as simple as this man who went to the mother and said, "Mother, I'm sorry, this is what I did." What did he do? He dragged it out, faced it, accepted that he had to place it before the mother, and then placed it before her. And it would be as simple as that. And it would mean at each step, if we know we have made an error, if we know we have slipped, we face that. Oh yes, this was a wrong movement. And then conceive of what is the right thing that you would want to have done. What would be the right expression that you would want? And then place it before the mother and say, "Mother, this is what happened. Help me to do this." Rather than focusing on get me free of that tendency, you focus on the thing you have to get to. Help me to do this. And you move forward. But the process is essentially this. It is a drawing out and a slaying. So the first is every covert, and the second is every not recognize as ego. I did it to help you. No, that's not true. Inside me, I did it because I wanted to do. Why did I want to do? And if I introspect, because it helps me. So there is another form one can give it. Recognize that everything you do has behind it some form of self-interest. Even if the self-interest is because I feel good, because it's the right thing for me to do, even that is a form of self-interest. And I say, fine. Everything I do has a form of self-interest. What's the self-interest here? And I observe. And since I've accepted that there's always a self-interest, it doesn't feel so strange to recognize what is the element of self-interest. There is, of course, also the interest to help my friend. But there is also a self-interest because he's my friend. And I observe these things with a kind of a detached, equal gaze. And as I begin to observe, I begin to see how there is a need to deceive. And then I recognize I don't need to because I'm accepting it. The tendency of disguising begins to fade. But we will see a more extreme disguise which he will show us. So every covert and disguise we have to pursue. And then, for its disguises are endless, and it will cling to every shred of possible self-concealment. And that's the nature of the ego. You remove this disguise, it pops up in a different disguise. You remove that, it pops up in a different form. This is the symbol used to describe Ravana. In the story of the Ramayana, Ravana is this gigantic ego person, great scholar, great warrior, man of knowledge, man of extraordinary administrative skill. And even Rama is asked to learn from him the true knowledge of administration. Man of great organization and wealth. He has built the most wealthy kingdom in the world. And he is the greatest devotee of Lord Shiva. When Shiva has to perform the Tandava, he will accept only for Ravana to play the musical instrument. And such a man is exaggerated in his self-importance to the point that he becomes asuric. And at that point, Rama has to kill him. And in the narration, he is described as every time his head is cut, another head pops up. Or sometimes he's described as having 10 heads. You knock out one and another pops up. Similar idea you will find in the travails of Hercules when he has to slay, I think it is the Hydra, multi-headed snake, and every time a head is chopped, a new pops up or many more pop up, or variations of the stories where every time a drop of blood falls on the ground, a new form emerges. All these stories which we find in our traditions are representative of this nature of the ego. You slay it, and yes, that form is slayed, but the essence, the blood dropping on the ground of our fertile nature simply causes another variation, a different form to emerge, which is still the ego. And each time it has a different appearance. So its disguises are endless and it will cling to every shred of possible self-concealment. Wherever there is something self-concealing, wherever it is possible, it will cling to that. So eventually we will be free of ego only when there is nothing in us which allows self-concealment, when all of us is fully open to the divine light, to our own conscious awareness, and everything is bared before the Lord. Now Sri Aurobindo points to two of its most powerful disguises. And the advantage of taking extreme examples is that they include all the variations in between. And these two he will develop quite a bit. Altruism and indifference are often its most effective disguises. So draped, it will riot boldly in the very face of the divine spies who are missioned to hunt it out. So the ego has two most effective disguises. There are billions, but these are most effective: altruism and indifference. In the first case, I am out to help you. I am trying to help the whole world. I am doing this as a service to humanity. And it's obvious to everybody that I have no obvious benefit from it. I am giving all my wealth, so many billions, that have been earned by Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, half of it they have given away now to charity. If you observe what the Bill Gates Foundation actually does, it promotes the influence of pharmaceutical industries. It promotes the use of Microsoft software through its charity. So yes, on the one hand, there is a charitable intent, but the intent conceals a more complex agenda. But behind it, we can ask, well, what would they have done with all those billions anyway? Their lifespan is not long enough to use it up. Their family is not large enough to use it up. And even if they give it away, it would take them years to use it up effectively. So what's the value in giving away something which anyway you're not using? It's what happens when there is a tsunami or an earthquake and there is a relief fund. Everybody goes to through their clothes, pulls out all the clothes they have not used for the last few years or which are outdated in fashion or which are faded in color. They take it out, pile it, and send it off as their contribution to the relief. Nobody goes and buys new clothes to send for the relief. It's the things we don't use that we want to give away. But these are the more obvious forms of how our altruism conceals self-interest. A more subtle form is the sense of self-importance that I have. I am the benefactor for so many. And each time I walk into those spaces where I have given my beneficence, everybody stands up, looks to me with gratitude, and I see these adoring, grateful eyes, and I feel good. Or if not, direct contact, the reports which come. So many thousands of people have been helped. Yes, I have done good work. So there is a different kind of self-importance, much more subtle, much more difficult to recognize. And it may have the appearance of great spontaneous generosity, but finally the test is what happens deep inside, which even I may not be conscious of. So that's why it's one of the most effective disguises of the ego. And the second most effective disguise is indifference. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Let them do what they like. My life is for other things. And in this indifference, one seems to be uninvolved, detached in its more extreme form. It may be the appearance even of the sannyasin who says, I don't care of the world, for the world, I'm indifferent to the world. I'm happy to live in my little cave, do my meditation, and experience my oneness with God. That would be one extreme form of it. Or people who say, I've stopped reading the newspapers, I don't watch TV, I'm just happy to do my sadhana in my little corner, and the world may go to the dogs. I knew someone who at the age of 80 said something like, if I'm about to die, I don't care what happens to the world after that. And these are various forms in which that indifference can appear. When we look at it as a third person, it seems strange. But when we experience it internally, when we say, I don't care for something or someone or a situation, the future or even the past, then we are covering up something inside, a self-interest which actually is bothered. It takes various forms, subtle forms, where because I'm bothered, I choose to insulate myself. Because I'm helpless, I choose to insulate myself. Because I don't know how to solve the problem, therefore I'm indifferent. It is concealing something which is troubled, but which is incapable, and therefore it covers up. Or sometimes one shows indifference as a way of showing how great we are. So I have an injury on my foot, it's hurting, it's bleeding, people get concerned, and I say, doesn't matter. And at that point, I feel great, I feel proud that here's something which would have got other people disturbed, and I am unaffected. So you will see people demonstrating their indifference in various ways. So draped, it, the ego, will riot boldly in the very face of the divine spies who are missioned to hunt it out. And now the same picture continues from what we saw before, where he used this image of the covert where the animal hides. Now you have divine spies whose job it is to hunt out and drag out this ego. But when this ego is now covered effectively in altruism and indifference, it will riot boldly in front of the divine spies. And the word riot here again has a deep sense. So riot we understand as unrestrained play. No restraint, no fear. I can do what I like because I know I won't be found out. But riot has a very specific sense in the vocabulary of hunting. And we use the connection earlier with the word covert. Riot is when the animals who are meant, or the people who are meant to hunt that particular animal, now turn attention to something else and get digressed. They are diverted from the original objective. And they chase after something totally different. And that is called a riot. So this disguised ego runs riot. That means instead of going after the actual hidden form of the ego, it diverts attention to other things, and it even diverts the divine spies who are missioned to hunt out the ego and says, look there, it's not here, it's over there, and diverts attention. So when I am altruistic, I am indifferent, that's the mask behind which my ego now can point to something else and say, there is the ego, not here. Not behind this form, but in other forms. And who are these divine spies? These, they can take various forms. The intuition which comes from above, the hound of heaven, the Vedic image of Sarama, the hound who is chasing by the light of intuition, goes deep into the darkness, into the cave and discovers the riches. It knows its way even when the way is not mapped, when the way is concealed even in darkness. It can go straight and point to, here is the problem. Discussing with the mother. The whole thing was audio taped, and then later somebody, his daughter has put photographs together to make it seem like a video. It's very beautifully done and you might like to see it. Where he's discussing how he's telling the mother that I do so much, but my family is always against me. My family does not appreciate. And the first response of the mother is straight to point this. You expect. He said, no, mother, it's not like that. And then he gives a different story. And you can see how mother backtracks from that position and then says, you must learn this and you must learn that. But the first point that she points is too uncomfortable. So she must take a step back, show something which is now accessible and more acceptable, preparing the way for a more direct dealing. But the intuition goes straight. And if we are capable of handling it, however painful, we accept and we deal with it. And this is one of the most effective of the divine spies. There are other spies, which is the light of our intellect, light of our self-observation, self-analysis, light of our understanding of how these things happen, what are the most common things, the light of reading, of study, the light of somebody else, an objective third person, giving you suggestions, all of these. But if altruism and indifference are the disguises, they can run riot and deflect even these spies. And so here we have to apply a very powerful tool, literally the Brahmastra, the one weapon against which nothing can resist. But you had a question.
How does one be conscious enough to distinguish between indifference stemming from ego and your indifference stemming from renunciation of worldly desire.
Yes. So how does one know? The question is, how does one know if it is true indifference coming from renunciation of worldly desires, or it is renunciation which is a disguise of the ego? The simple test would be that you can accept the very thing that you can renounce, that you have renounced, if it is so demanded of you. Having renounced this, a situation happens in life that you have to now accept it. Would you accept? If at that point you cling to the declared renunciation, then very likely it is an ego-based renunciation. If the situation demands, one should be able to do whatever is required. In fact, Sri Aurobindo will answer this question now with a very large picture and a few examples. The point he makes, though, is finally the test is internal. There is no satisfactory objective test, because any form can be used as these infinite disguises and variations and concealments of the ego. Because it is so complex, you cannot deal with it by simple means. So the Brahmastra here, the formula of the supreme knowledge comes to our help. This is a reference to the Bhagavad Gita, the supreme knowledge which Sri Krishna leads Arjuna to, which resolves everything in a single action. We have nothing to do in our essential standpoint with these distinctions, for there is no I nor thou, but only one divine self, equal in all embodiments, equal in the individual and the group. And to realize that, to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that, is all that matters. I'll read the rest so we have the full picture. Self-satisfaction and altruism, enjoyment and indifference are not the essential thing. If the realization, fulfillment, service of the one self demands from us an action that seems to others self-service or self-assertion in the egoistic sense, or seems egoistic enjoyment and self-indulgence, that action we must do. We must be governed by the guide within rather than by the opinions of men. The influence of the environment works often with great subtlety. We prefer and put on almost unconsciously the garb which will look best in the eye that regards us from outside. And we allow a veil to drop over the eye within. We are impelled to drape ourselves in the vow of poverty or in the garb of services, or in the outward proof of indifference and renunciation and the spotless sainthood, because that is what tradition and opinion demand of us. And so we can make best an impression on our environment. But all this is vanity and delusion. We may be called upon to assume these things, for that may be the uniform of our service. But equally, it may not. The eye of man outside matters nothing. The eye within is all. So this is the full text of the rest of the paragraph. Now this gives us the full picture, and now we'll look at it in detail. The point being, there are situations where we may be demanded to do exactly the opposite of what the conventional understanding of renunciation will be. And then, if the situation so demands, we should be able to do it. So how do we know? What is the reference of what is the demand of the situation? What is that perspective which is most true, most complete, most free? And that is what he has described as the formula of the supreme knowledge. And that is, there is no I, form in the universe, human, animal, plant, insect, material, whatever it is, every single form is its embodiment, and the self is equal in all those embodiments. Equal in the individual and the group. So we have seen individual embodiments, and then there are group embodiments, collectives which form. There is the ant, and then there is the anthill. There's the bee and there's the hive. There's the individual human, and then there is society, or even pockets within society, several hierarchies of groupings. In each of those groups, equally, it is the one self. And to realize that, to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that is all that matters. Now this is, you may say, this is a tall order. This is too much to attain, to achieve. I don't even know if I will reach self-realization in this lifetime. And you're asking me to realize, express, serve, and fulfill that as the only solution to get free of the ego. That means what? I have to wait until I attain self-realization, which may happen by the end of this life or not, and only then I might consider getting free from the ego. It's not so. In fact, this is a very brief summary of something which is discussed more elaborately in his essays on the Gita. But you can see how this perspective, this way of looking at things, can be cultivated right now as we are in whatever condition of our consciousness. We start with this idea that there is one self, immanent in all things. You want to visualize it as the presence of the divine, which is there in all things. It is equally there inside this flower as it is in the whole bunch of flowers, as it is in the grouping of the flowers with the table, as it is in the grouping of this room, and in each individual, and so on. Just dwell on this idea and remind yourself of it every now and then. And then, when you have to deal with a particular situation, consider what would be the perspective of this one consciousness which is in everybody. So let's say we have a group discussion right now to discuss our project and what decision we should take. I like my friends. I don't want to betray them. I have a preference for this idea. I like it to happen this way. I find the other person's idea too radical. And all of these likes and dislikes are attached to individuals. If I take a stance above it all, oneself in all these beings, each viewpoint equally valid, the group viewpoint itself infused with the self, the company or the institution which we serve is also equally imbued with the self, and all of humanity and the earth and all nature and the environment. And now from this viewpoint, what's the best action? There will be a best action which transcends my likes and dislikes, the other person's likes and dislikes, and even our collective like and dislike and collective bias. There is an action which is good for the all, which is right in the eyes of the all. That is the thing to be done. Now we may choose to scale it back because our meeting is specific to our institution which we serve. And so we may choose to align to the institutional goal. But the institution also serves a larger purpose. We may say, for my company, it is good if we have higher profits, for which we have higher sales, for which our goods must break down after 2 years of use. Which is good, which is right for the company. But when I see the large picture of the earth and Mother Nature, then that wastefulness which is designed into our products is a crime. And then I have to choose whether I serve the company's interests or the larger good. And if I can align my company's interests with the larger good, then I will receive, even in the company, the support of Mother Nature. If my company's interests are in conflict with Mother Nature, well, eventually the company will weaken, fail, collapse. So if I keep in mind this large picture, both in space and in time, then everything begins to realign automatically. And then my individual action is not in conflict with the preferences or actions of the group, which are not in conflict with the need for the company, which is not in conflict with the need of the whole, with the one. This perspective we can begin to cultivate as we are today, even with our mind, with our mind's understanding, with our thoughts perspective. And it doesn't mean you will get it immediately perfectly, but you will begin to grow and widen in your mind bit by bit. And every now and then you will realize, oh, there was a limitation here, and something will open up further. And the same can begin to happen in the heart. When I begin to realize that each one's feelings are legitimate in themselves, but each is limited within their capacity and incapacity. But there is something larger which shares in the hearts of all beings. And as I become aware of that, my heart can embrace even those who seem to oppose me out of hatred or ill will. And I can still say, oh, poor people, they are victims of their own pettiness and narrowness. And with compassion, I can embrace. And not only in my mind's vision, but in the heart's embracement, I feel, I experience, not perfectly, whatever limitation, it's good. And from there it grows, and it grows one step at a time. And then eventually, even in my senses, I look at things, I look at people, I look at situations, and I see how there is one great divine purpose being fulfilled through all these things, working through all these circumstances, through their constant conflicts and oppositions. It finds its way, it is navigating, compelling them secretly behind the scenes. And I see it, and I wish it didn't have to be so slow. It didn't have to be through such a tangle of cross purposes of interests. If only we could all align with it, we could just flow rapidly to what is meant to be, the future which is waiting to be born. And I see it even in my senses. And so one begins to be more and more infused with this vision, which Sri Aurobindo has described as the formula of the supreme knowledge. And that comes to our aid. It cuts through all the disguises of the ego. It exposes all the coverts in which the ego could hide. And even the most extreme forms of altruism and indifference cannot protect from this formula of the supreme knowledge. And so Sri Aurobindo now gives specifically examples of how it would work. Just before that, we look at the 4 steps that are then implied to realize that, to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that. Now let's consider, before even I have the full realization, I have a partial realization at least, and that's acceptable. The realization that I and you and all of us equally have the presence of the self. I realized it in my mind, in my idea, and that's a good step. It does not mean it is a complete identification with the self in all beings. It can be a partial mental realization, but it's a step, and always a step towards something more. I feel in my heart this compassion, and that is a step. I see how through all our complexities, something is moving. That's a realization. They are partial, but they're good, they're useful, and we use them. So to realize that, and then to express that. Obviously, when you realize that, your actions change. You will now act based on this realization. So you begin to express that, to serve that. The moment there is a greater possibility, and you feel it is how things are intended to be, it is the divine will, it is the beautiful future that is waiting, automatically one begins now to dwell on that, and what we do is done in service to that. And the principle of karma yoga and bhakti yoga weave in automatically. And finally, he says, to fulfill that. And in this fourth step, the sense of I serving has vanished. Everything is a movement of fulfillment of that, using me even as a support, using me as a vehicle, and I'm happy to be a means of its fulfillment. And just using these four words, he is weaving together the practice of the karma yoga, the bhakti yoga, and the jnana yoga, merging in these four steps in different parts of the being, spontaneously, simultaneously. So it's a very deep formulation, and it is worth rereading and dwelling upon. Now he describes how this works in the question of altruism and indifference. So what is the opposite of altruism? Self-satisfaction. Satisfying myself or servicing others. These are the two opposites. And what's the opposite of the other? You have indifference versus personal enjoyment. And now we take these two pairs, this pair and that pair together. Self-satisfaction and altruism. Self-satisfaction and altruism. Enjoyment and indifference are not the essential thing. So we just discard all these issues. Am I doing it for my satisfaction? Doesn't matter. Am I doing it as a service to others? Doesn't matter. Am I doing it for my enjoyment? Doesn't matter. Am I doing it out of indifference or not doing it out of indifference? Doesn't matter. They are not the essential thing. So what is? If the realization, fulfillment, service of the oneself demands from us an action, that action we must do. This is all that matters. So what is our relationship again? Realization, fulfillment, and service of the oneself. Bring back the idea of the oneself. Oneself, which is fulfilling itself, which we want to serve to fulfill. And we put ourselves, dedicate our lives to serving that. No other interest. Not my enjoyment nor my indifference matters. What matters is the fulfillment of the self and service to the self. Not my self-satisfaction nor altruism matters. What matters is, am I serving the self? So serving others or serving myself is irrelevant. Serving self is all that matters. Enjoyment of myself or indifference to others is irrelevant. Self is all that I see. And so if that demands, service to the oneself demands from us an action, that action we must do. Even if, and now he lists what it may look like to somebody else, an action that seems to others self-service or self-assertion in the egoistic sense, or seems egoistic enjoyment and self-indulgence. That action we must do. Now, in this formulation of what it seems to others, there are again very subtle hints. A very important description here. If it seems to others self-service or self-assertion in the egoistic sense, so I'm serving myself. I'm asserting myself with a self-interest, or so it seems to others. What it seems to others, that it seems to them to be egoistic, or it may not seem to them to be egoistic. I may assert myself, I may serve myself. There is a distinction between these two. So I assert myself, I serve, I serve myself because I have this larger objective. So, as Prime Minister of India, one has to do certain things. I have to assert myself in order that a larger objective is fulfilled for the country, isn't it? So it may seem as if from outside there is not much ego. Or on the other hand, I may say, but I want to do this, and the intention is not of the country but my personal interest. I want to have a larger house because I feel good. And so it may seem self serving. And there's a distinction between the two. Now, from the perspective of the self, neither of these will matter. But on a practical level, there is a distinction between these two. And Sri Aurobindo is deliberately highlighting this extreme where even to others it seems to be egoistic. But in this categorizations we may make in the normal perspective of humanity, there are going from the most selfish, where only I benefit at the massive loss to others. I can rise to a higher level where I benefit, others also may benefit, or at least they don't have a loss. Or I benefit hugely and others benefit a little bit when my company shares price go up. Or I benefit a lot and others benefit equally with me. Or one level higher, others benefit immensely and I have the satisfaction that I could benefit them though I have no other personal benefit. And so you could go up the scale like this, where you start with I as the center of the universe and everyone else loses, to the extreme where everyone benefits and I lose, and even I die so that others can benefit. And you can have the full scale of variations. In the extreme, you take this point where only I benefit and everyone loses. But finally, all this scale, although in human terms they are superior, and they are useful for us in an intermediate stage of development. For the Brahmastra, the great formula of the supreme knowledge, they are all equivalent. We must rise above all of them into this large picture. Now, this being our reference, let's understand that in practice, we will face situations where, knowing full well what we must do, we feel compelled to compromise. And this is the reality of human life, of our weakness, of our incapacity, of the conflict we face, of the ego and other parts of our being, desires and others. I know this I must give up, but right now, just let me indulge a little more, and then later I will give it up. So at that point, these distinctions suddenly matter. Where we can rise above them straight to that large vision of the self and serving the self, these are all equivalent, they don't matter. Where we're somewhere in between still and we find ourselves in a situation of compromise, we must always make an effort to move one step higher for a greater good, because it brings us closer to a greater liberation. So this is important, and he hints at this in the way he formulates this sentence. If the realization, fulfillment, service of the oneself demands from us an action that seems to others self-service or self-assertion in the egoistic sense, or seems egoistic enjoyment and self-indulgence, that action we must do, even though it seems like that to others. Now, straight away, it puts us in conflict. People think, but I have to do. And then there is a conflict because I have to face the consequences of people. And I should be prepared for that if I have this larger picture. We must be governed by the guide within rather than by the opinions of others. When we begin thus to introspect, seeking the inner guide, again we face the same situation. Am I deceiving myself? Am I justifying to myself because somewhere inside it feels convenient? And that's where again that honesty, that sincerity, and being able to stand before the mother and say, Mother, here it is, that comes to our aid. And so this is really the part of the sadhana which becomes the crux of the problem. Now, Sri Aurobindo describes how this pressure from the environment pushes us, and it is subtle. The influence of the environment works often with great subtlety. We prefer, so it starts with an inclination, a slight shift. We prefer and put on, almost unconsciously, the garb which will look best in the eye that regards us from outside. And we allow a veil to drop over the eye within. Slight tendency, again a slight tendency, and again, and again, and again. And each time there is a veil, a thin layer placed. Eventually all the thin layers pile up, and then you cannot see anymore. It starts with a very small step, a small compromise, and then it builds up. In the domain of conscience, it begins like this. Somebody is incorruptible. If you can squeeze him until he gives in on a tiny point, the rest of the journey is assured. It happened in Parliament in India in the 60s, I believe, where somebody stood up and declared, corruption is not a problem, it is only 10%. We need not worry. From then, within 20 years, it became 90%. The moment you have said, this is not a problem and you can ignore it and allow that compromise, it grows. And then it grows very quietly, subtly, and before you know it, it has taken over. So he says, we prefer, it's just a slight tendency, and put on unconsciously the garb which will look best in the eye that regards us from outside. So the image here is very powerful, but it has three levels of meaning. The garb we put on, the dress that we have worn. So at a most material level, you're going to meet somebody important. What do? You look for your best clothes. If you're going to meet your own family members in an informal meeting, you don't care. Oh, this is fine. You go on. Why? What difference does it make that you have put on your best clothes? They are ironed, they're clean, they're bright, they're new. The person's impression of you will change according to what clothes you wear. If you go with shabbily dressed, crinkled, faded clothes, they will look at you and look away. They won't recognize your importance, right? Whereas you wear these shiny, bright, crisply ironed clothes, they look at you and know that you're an important person. And this is what's happening very subconsciously in us. And so we put on clothes to match the occasion. My family members, anyway, they don't care for me. It doesn't matter. And it's so this is the first physical level at which it happens. But the clothes are a symbol for the appearance of behavior. So I'm meeting a new person, I'm smiling, I put on my best front. Yes, how are you? And then meanwhile there's a phone call. And my whole face changes. No, this is not right. Don't bother me now. Call me later. I'm in a meeting. And then again I go back to my smile. So this is a more subtle form of the clothing. My whole behavior switches depending on who I'm dealing with. Sometimes it is so strange when we interact with people who are used to that world. They go into spaces of power, corridors of power, as we say, and suddenly they are this effusively humble, polite, nice, and then they come out and the face immediately changes, the whole body language changes. You could never have imagined this man could be that man. And it is only when you've seen people switching zones like this that you begin to understand truly how complex human nature is. There's a third level of this draping ourselves, and that is happening at a deep internal psychological level of the way we represent ourselves to ourselves, not to others. I am this very nice, sweet, caring, loving, gentle, etc. person. That's the image I have of myself. And anybody who challenges that, I react sharply. I'm so sensitive, I'm so considerate of people. The person says, "Oh, no, you're not. What do you mean?" And I get very agitated. Because there is a coating you have to put for yourself to your own sense of well being. If suddenly you were to remove that coating and see the junk, the clutter, the filth of substance of human nature, it is so shocking you cannot stand, you will collapse. It's so bad. And so, to be able to stand, to be able to face yourself, you have to create some kind of an image. And so, this is the third level at which the layers form. And those are the most difficult to remove. Only a few weeks ago, we read from the aphorism, you will recall, Sri Aurobindo writes how the divine pulls at our clothes of vices, and we're happy to let them go. But when he pulls at our clothing of virtue, we resist. And then he writes, it is only when he pulled them away by force that I realized how I had been deceiving myself. And it is only when those layers of your virtues are pulled out that you can truly meet yourself as you truly are, as the soul within. Even the layers of virtue cover and prevent you from meeting the true self. And so when he uses this term garb, you can see how many levels it is represented. We can catch the levels which are most obvious for us, but then they are symbols of these deeper levels. The influence of the environment works often with great subtlety. We prefer and put on almost unconsciously the garb which will look best in the eye that regards us from outside. Now, in that very act, we have put ourselves in the eyes of the other person and see ourselves. How do I look to them? And the way we do it practically, physically, is to stand before the mirror. Do I look nice? How will they respond when they see this image of me? And I'm seeing me through their eyes as I look in the mirror. No, this is too bright. And I change my clothes. You've seen people do this when they go on a date. Because the first impression is so important. I want to put the one thing which will really get me the result I need. But this is the same thing which happens on other levels also. Because we look objectively from the other person's eyes, I need to be a nice person in the eyes of others. My own eyes, when I look, are turned like this, as if from outside seeing in. And as a result, and we allow a veil to drop over the eye within. The thing which would have seen from inside out gets covered up because you have done this outside in perspective. Neglecting but actively covering, both things happen. When you neglect by disuse, the inner sight begins to fade. The reverse is also true. If you focus exclusively on the inner sight, by neglect, the outer sight begins to fade. Literally, physically. If all the time you see from the inner sight, from the mind's eye, from the inner seeing, from even the subtle senses, after a while your physical sight begins to weaken. But the reverse, when you see from the outer sight, this begins to weaken. But after that weakening, we have put layers. And so there is the loss. The inner sight is now covered up with the pretty pictures we have put of ourselves. It cannot see through directly. And then we are in. look in the regard, and we allow a veil to drop over the eye within, we are impelled to drape ourselves, now in view of the others, in the vow of poverty, or in the garb of service, or in outward proofs of indifference and renunciation and a spotless sainthood, because that is what tradition and opinion demand of us. And because so we can make best an impression on our environment. Now forget what your actual role is in life. You may be declared as a sadhaka, living in the ashram, in Oroville, in looking after one of the centers, or people know you have a spiritual bent of mind, spiritual interest, you're a practitioner of such and such a path, belonging to such and such a tradition. And at that point, of course, it's obvious to have some appearance of renunciation, sainthood, indifference, service, and that helps. But even if you're not like that, you are a known crook in the local environment, still, if you put on that garb, it helps. And so there is a tendency always to put on this kind of an appearance to have the best impression, the best result, which is also reasonable in a practical life. I have faced this difficulty in strange forms, and I thought it an occasion to share the thinking which I went through myself. So I am with friends in their house for a few days because I'm traveling for some programs, and so my hosts, they have some food, I share with them. They know I'm vegetarian, so they are careful to not bring non-vegetarian, or they eat separately, and that's fine. And then someone asks, do you take alcohol? Do you take wine? And I say no. And the problem I have in my mind is that I know that this is an expected response because, well, if you're a sadhaka, you're following a spiritual life, alcohol is forbidden. In my understanding, though, that's not such a big deal because, as we have learned, the mother did not make a deal of it. Not only she didn't, where she found someone was stubborn, she broke that rule also. Just for certain reasons, spiritual reasons even, to get free. Precisely for this reason, you should be able to do whatever is demanded. And so in my mind, I have set myself the standard that if the situation so demands, I should be able to do it. But fortunately, the situation has not so demanded, and I have preferred not to do it, which is wonderful also. But I can't explain all this. It won't make sense. And so the person asks, you have not even tasted? Fortunately, I can say, no, I have not. Well, except when in chocolate, perhaps sometimes they put some flavorings. It's happened by chance, it has gone in. It's okay, not a big deal. Have you eaten meat? No. Once it happened that somebody gave food and they said it was vegetarian. I ate it and I thought it was strange, and then I had to spit it out. Well, okay. But I can't explain to them that I don't have an issue with drinking wine or eating meat. If you want to, you can have it, and if I needed to, I would. So it's just a preference. If I try to explain this, it will be too much for them to recognize, because a person who's in a spiritual life must fit into this set framework. So for me, it has been always a bit of a strange thing in dealing with it. Fortunately, I have not had a problem so far. That's all I can say. It happened once though. Kumud Ben, who was mother's personal attendant, she was sitting, and we're sitting across the table. It was a discussion on some homeopathy. I was to get some homeopathic medicine. And so she said, you have not had alcohol? I said, no, I don't take. And I made the mistake of saying, as a principle, I don't take. And she caught that word and said, you have a principle? Well, we have to break it. That's what mother made us do. Whenever we said principle, she made us break it. And she took this alcohol, which they use for preserving the homeopathic medicine, put it in a little thing and said, drink it, drink it. Oh, it was such a difficult time. And so I held it and I went through a whole drama of being embarrassed. I know she's right, but I don't want to take it because I have to protect myself and say, I have not drunk alcohol. If somebody asks me, remember, that's the thing I have to keep. Not for my personal image, but because it's the image of the institution. If I say, yes, I drink alcohol and I come from Sri Aurobindo ashram, that's not nice for Sri Aurobindo or his ashram. So I have to be able to say, no, I have never drunk alcohol. And so I'm doing this. I'm trying to see who will break first. So eventually, when they were not looking, I poured most of it into, there was a bowl of flowers. I poured most of it there, and then there was a little bit left, and I had moved my hand. Oh, she said, oh, you've drunk it, that's nice. I think I got away with it, but the point being, I would not have had a problem if that was so demanded. I did put it to my lips. I don't think I ingested it, but the point being, all these are artificial formations. However useful they are, and we accept their usefulness, we accept their importance, but they're still artificial formations. A situation will come in life which will demand of you the very opposite of your principle, of your vow, and for a cause which is greater than you or even greater than us. And at that point, well, you should be able to do it. So I give this example because it's amusing, but still it points to this problem. You will find in practically every tradition, there are stories of how some great saint did things which were immoral, and still he was a great saint. And the reason, of course, is in their spiritual consciousness, the morality and immorality have no relevance. But these stories have a meaning only at that point, after you have attained to that freedom. If you take the example, so-and-so saint did this and therefore I can do this, then of course the whole point is lost. It was something like that which happened when Sri Aurobindo was, as you know, he was smoking. When that was the culture he had imbibed when he was in England. So even up to Pondicherry, when he had started his sadhana, he was still smoking. And then he explained, he said, I want to show that one can smoke and still do sadhana. It does not come in the way of the spiritual realizations. Of course, you will find also Mother's description of how smoking clouds the consciousness, prevents the spiritual light from entering and establishing, and so on. But the point was that Sri Aurobindo had to demonstrate this, that the essential process is always psychological. Whatever the physical compulsions, that it does not prevent an essential psychological process to overcome even the limitations of the physical compulsions. So he was also eating meat as a Bengali fish he used to take. And then one day, once the disciples began to grow in number, the mother made a gesture of the smell being not nice. And Sri Aurobindo took the message and he set aside the cigar, never touched it again, had no withdrawal symptoms. It was just like that. And the example of complete renunciation, just like that you discard without needing it ever again. Mother, of course, also commented that it would have set a bad example for others, because the disciples also had begun to think, oh, he's smoking, so why can't we? And that would have started a very different problem. So we accept the values of all these systems, social norms, even the truth that certain things are harmful in the spiritual path, and we follow all of them. But if the realization, fulfillment, service of the one self demands from us an action that seems to others self-service or self-assertion in the egoistic sense, or seems egoistic enjoyment and self-indulgence, that action we must do. So, the things he has indicated as the drapes we put, the vow of poverty, the garb of service, outward proofs of indifference. We need to demonstrate that we don't care. And the proof of renunciation and spotless sainthood. So all these are the various kinds of garbs, and we can dwell upon each of these and see how they work in us. And they're very interesting. They all represent categories of different things that we put on like this. Poverty is one of those forms which is greatly celebrated. The sign of somebody, I'm sorry, again I have to take examples of from politicians. We have people in politics who put on the garb of poverty. Mahatma Gandhi was one of them. And he had to demonstrate his indifference to money, his rejection of wealth, and the service which he had to do. Even he, I don't know if it was him or some other, I think it was him, he proudly said a businessman had given him a check of a large amount, and he tore the check and threw it. And this is presented to the younger generations as a symbol of greatness. And that's the error. That's the perversion. I remember in one of the journals connected with the ashram, there was a story, I think it was from the Jataka tales, but a story of this elephant in the forest who had the tusks of golden material. And then there is a woodcutter who is in the forest. He is wanting demands. Now I have a nice house, but my children need education, so can I cut a little more and a little more and a little more? Eventually all the tusks are cut, and he cuts it out to the last bit, and the elephant, bleeding, falls down unconscious and dies. And the gods assemble above and they shower flowers on him. So I was told this story, something from one of the ashram's journals, and I said, but this is so terrible. This is completely contrary to the teaching of Sri Aurobindo. Is this kind of self-denial, self-abnegation to the point of self-destruction an example of spirituality? Is this greatness? This is ridiculous. This is misuse. This is that perversion of celebrating weakness and poverty as spiritual, as great. And this unfortunately got imbued during the freedom struggle by some of these symbols who proudly demonstrated their weakness and poverty as great signs. I'm sorry to give this example, but when Gandhiji asked people to oppose the British, take off your turban, offer your head to be whacked, get it bandaged and come back to heal, and then go again and get your head whacked, to me it is a perversion. It is taking pride in pain. There's a perversion involved there. And if you had that kind of courage to bear pain, you should have acted with force where necessary. Wealth itself, similarly, has been for so long thrown away as unspiritual that Sri Aurobindo makes this comment, Asuras have taken it, and we need to conquer it back from the Asuras. And there is a taint. Wealth has got so associated with the Asuric interests that when the money comes into your hands, there is a taint, there is a coloring of that energy. And we need to even free the wealth from that taint, because innately the wealth is a divine property, not an Asuric property. So there's a whole process now to be gone through to undo this kind of a distortion which has come into the culture, the values of society and the world, especially in relation to spirituality. When the founder of the Sri Aurobindo Society, Navjatji, was traveling, he was formerly a businessman and a wealthy one, so he would travel business class in those days, and that was a lot of money. Somebody complained to the mother, "Mother, he's going for your work and he's traveling business class." And mother said, "Why can't my children travel in comfort?" Is it necessary that because you are a child of the divine that you have to suffer more than those who are children of asuras? It doesn't make sense somehow when you think of it this way. Of course, if you don't have the money, then you work within the means. You put up with whatever physical discomforts are necessary because you don't have a choice. But if the resources are given, and there's nothing wrong. So the true renunciation would be based on this equality, that whatever the means available, you make the best of the circumstances with the best means given to you without particular attachment to this or that. And where comfort, wealth, or even praise, appreciation, importance come your way, you deal with it with this in the same way that you would criticism or poverty or neglect. I remember long ago, it gets too personal, but still it is worth sharing. Initially, when I had certain programs with large groups, I would come away with a sense of a glow, of something which was received, a certain intensity, and I would bask in that. I would feel good, and I felt it was necessary to hold what was received. And then one day, somebody in the ashram told me this. He said, after you have spoken, you should be able to walk away as if nothing happened. And I said, that's not right. I received something also along with others, and I should be able to value that and hold that. And later, I went through certain experiences as a result of which I realized the value of what he had said. That I should actually be able to walk away and feel as if nothing had happened. And that was something, it was a great lesson for me. It reminds me of another example where Champaklalji was narrating to the mother, Mother, I did this and this and this. And mother interrupted him and said, Champaklal, don't show off. And Champaklal said, no, mother, I actually did this. And he again started repeating. Again, mother interrupted. Champaklal, very sternly, she said, don't show off. And Champaklal says, I was narrating pure fact, no exaggerations. But still, he said, after many years, he said, I understood what she meant. And we'll think about it. I may be narrating fact. It's not the form of what I speak. It is the thing I am feeling inside me, that exaltation, the sense of aggrandizement of self-importance, however subtle it may be. That was what she was pointing to, don't show off. I've actually done this extraordinary thing, and I say, look here, I've done it. I may do it, if you see often children do something, they've made, oh look, it's so beautiful. Or I may do it feeling I have become so important as a result. And that's the part that she was hitting at, don't show off. There's nothing wrong in showing it to people. It's what's happening inside. Always it's the inside which she is pointing to. And this is what Sri Aurobindo is taking us to. So, outward proof of indifference and renunciation, the need to show, is itself a sign that there's a problem there, that the ego is hiding behind. Otherwise, you won't need to show. You will do the thing, you will walk away, nobody will even know. But the fact that you need to say, I denied, I rejected, I tore the check in front and dropped it before him. I don't need your money. You see how large the ego has become. If you didn't need it, you could say, well, I don't need it, I have all my circumstances, why don't you put it to that work where it may be more useful? You could have done that if you really didn't need it. But in this case, you needed to show that poverty. And garb of service, proof of indifference and renunciation, and then the spotless sainthood. Mother commented on this many times. She said, when people come to me, they come putting on this garb of saint, as if they're the perfect, sweetest, nicest people. And she said, for me, it makes things more difficult because it's a garb. She has to cut through that. And she said, I prefer that you come to me as you are. You think about what that means. You are casually sitting in your room all alone, doing nothing in particular, or doing something silly or stupid, as you are. Can you walk before the mother and say, here, mother, this is what I am? Not even attaching yourself to that thing and saying, I want to be like that, but this is what I am when I'm normal, relaxed, without anyone watching me. Why do we need to put on that pretense or appearance? Yes, we want to be concentrated, we want to be able to receive what she gives, but without that pretense of being something we are not. Here I am, and I become concentrated and I receive and I offer myself, ask her to mold me, shape me, free me, purify me. But she said, when you go like that, like a child, without any pretense, without any expectation of any kind, then she said she can act most directly. And this is the reason why she took up that experiment of working with children, even going to the details of dealing with them in material things as a physical mother, until they lost all sense of who she was. She was just their physical mother. So that they need not hold these barriers in between, so that she could act directly in them. Of course, it had its benefits and then it had its limitations. Somebody in the ashram was asked, who grew up as a child here, was asked by someone coming from outside, oh, what was it like to be with the mother? And he expected a wonderful description. And she said, oh, nothing, just like being with your physical mother. Nothing. That's how it was. She gave us groundnuts, and that's all. So you missed something in the process also, but well, that's human nature. You gain here, you lose there. So we consciously avoid all these things, get free of them. But Sri Aurobindo says, but all this is vanity and delusion. We may be called upon to assume these things, for that may be the uniform of our service. Now, this may be a requirement that you have to demonstrate proof of indifference, proof of renunciation, put on the garb of service, put on poverty if needed, be saintly looking if needed, because that's the uniform that you have to put on as part of your service. That's not you, and you're not attached to the uniform. When the service is over, you drop the uniform. So when I'm a driver, I put on the dress of a driver. When I'm in the army, then I put on my army uniform. When I come home, then I put on my home uniform. When I'm before God, I remove all my uniforms. I am bare, naked, as I am. And this is the image you find of the gopis before Sri Krishna. When he steals their clothes when they are bathing, and he refuses to give them back the clothes, demands that they be before him bare, without any pretense of appearances. And the gopis always represent the human soul, the divine as the Lord. We have to be bare before him. In the act of work, when an assignment is given to you, you may have to put on a uniform for that purpose. You do it, and that's it. The clothes are dropped. We may be called upon to assume these things, which he has just described as vanity and delusion, for they may be the uniform of our service, but equally, it may not. The eye of man outside matters nothing. The eye within is all. And so this brings the focus back to sincerity, to face ourselves before the mother and be. So this is the paragraph on the renunciation of this center of egoism. The means he has given is the formula of the supreme knowledge. And I read that again because this is what we have to imprint. We have nothing to do in our essential standpoint with these distinctions. For there is no I nor thou, but only one divine self, equal in all embodiments, equal in the individual and the group. And to realize that, to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that is all that matters. Sri Aurobindo gives examples now from the Bhagavad Gita, from the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna, of how it was from ego can play these different appearances. But the essence is in this paragraph which we have just completed. And there comes a time in our life where we have sometimes to make a supreme choice. Very often it may not matter here, it may not matter there. So a little bit of adjustment may be acceptable. But there will always be a time, especially for a sadhaka in the spiritual life, where life circumstances will compel you to choose at great personal cost to test your loyalty. Are you here? Are you willing to sacrifice everything for the divine? And you must be able to make that choice when the test is given to you. At other times, mother says also, why can't my children travel in comfort? Why can't my children have all the material comforts? And she has given us everything. Those of us who live in the ashram, we have a life more comfortable than normal. And after all that, are we willing to give ourselves up? And the sacrifice may be internal, purely psychological, to be able to give up all your ego, desire, preference, or it may be compelled on you by an external pattern of physical life circumstance where you say, I'm willing to lose it all, but I will not let go of my commitment, my conviction, and my service to the Lord. For the divine, I'm willing to let go, lose everything, including my physical life. Because I'm born of Him, for Him, my body, my mind, even my soul are His. They're formed out of His substance. Who am I to say whether I have a choice in this or not? And one can go to that point where you say, what you will, what you will. And if you have a situation like this, you are fortunate. Because when you can cross that line, it is such a great freedom. After that, there is no problem in life which can ever bother you. Because you have made that last choice, that sacrifice. So we pause here and we can take up any questions and comments you had.
Based on what you just said, have you attained spiritual fearlessness? There was a story. There was this lady in the Delhi ashram. She very apparently it's a true story. She goes to the samadhi and says, "Mother, now I'm ready for the spiritual life." Next day, both her parents died in a car accident.
Ouch.
She shattered and stuff. So these kind of things, they kind of scare
Yes.
How do you gain spiritual?
Well, if you didn't know this story, okay, the narration was of a lady, it's a real story, a lady who went to the samadhi and said, I'm ready for the spiritual life now. And the next day, both her parents died in a car crash. So if you didn't know the story, you would not think the choice of accepting spiritual life to be so scary, right? The story is what creates the scare. But yes, other examples like that. Yes, but also let me put it another way. Something of the inner being sensed what was coming. And in preparing for it, it asserted this choice of readiness. So if you see the cause and effect, it's not because she chose that the car accident took place. It's more like the thing was happening anyway. The inner being sensed it and made a strong affirmation to be able to steel itself to bear that and to use it as an occasion for a forward push. So the story need not be so scary when you reverse the sequence of cause and effect. But when you speak of courage, it seems to be a question of courage when the spiritual life is seen as something extremely difficult. But if you see the full picture, the spiritual life is when you align yourself with the divine will. The non-spiritual life is when you go out of sync with the divine will. Tell me which is easier, to flow with the current or to flow against the current? So the idea that spiritual life is difficult comes from a wrong understanding of it. It means I have to do so much, I have to give up so much. And it's all associated with these wrong ideas of renunciation. If we recognize spiritual life here is to follow my deepest aspiration, to fulfill what the divine is anyway pushing circumstances to, with or without our consent. and now I accept to join in that effort, the whole thing seems actually much simpler, much easier, more direct than anything else you could do. Spiritual life is waking up to the fact that this is what I wanted to do to begin with. I had forgotten and I had lost my way. And now I'm going to do what I actually want. So I'm more happy, in fact, isn't it? I'm more fulfilled. So the concept of what we mean by spiritual life needs to undergo a major correction in the popular consciousness, because there's a huge confusion there. Yes. Yes.
You said that wealth is a property of divine. In the present situation, it is in the hand of the and what we can do to take it out?
Sura. The method Sri Aurobindo has described in the booklet The Mother, where he discusses money, the nature of money power, and how we should deal with it. So, not only wealth is property of the divine, let's take another step and say, you are property of the divine, right? And so, the wealth is given to you by the divine to fulfill his work. You belong to the divine and are here to fulfill his work. You are in fact a part of him. You are the drop of the ocean that was put out on a mission by the ocean. You're not separate from the ocean, right? And then the wealth is given to you as a tool formed out of the ocean itself to be applied for the purpose of the mission. That's it. When you start thinking in this way, there is no personal attachment to the money itself, or even to your own personal life and its comforts. Yes, it's nice to be comfortable. I don't want to be uncomfortable needlessly. But where I don't have a choice, I say, well, that's how it is. Let's move on, right? So when the thinking itself shifts out from this center of looking at the universe through these eyes and putting yourself in the center, and you start looking at it from this big picture of the ocean, of the whole, of the one all, of the self, then your personal likes and dislikes become somehow not so important. The money is given, you have to use it, you use it. The money is taken away from you, okay, I don't need to use it anymore. When it is given, I use it again, rightly, as far as I can. So the shifting out from your personal interest changes the whole relationship with the money power.
It's important how it comes to you. Is it important?
Is it important how the money comes to you?
The way it comes.
The way. And you mean whether by legal means or illegal means and such things?
No, it is, but whether you earn yourself or somebody gives to you, or how it's important.
If you are working in a social framework, and if there is something coming to you in the framework which has consequences, for use for the divine, you only are an intermediate trustee who is supposed to put it from here to there and make right use of it. That's all. So then it doesn't matter where it comes from, right? The framework of law is relevant because the consequences of an illegal flow of funds would harm the larger work. So you have to take that into account. But if it happened that the money is put at your doorstep, you don't know where it comes from, if it is drug money or not, it is irrelevant as long as you go through the process which is relevant for the law of the space that you operate in. There's something I wanted to add to this. As long as you do not allow the sense of I own the money, you are reasonably fine. You may misapply, you may wrongly apply from incompetence, from incapacity, or from confusion. But the moment you know what's right, you make a correction for it. Knowing that if you misapply, you will face consequences. That's also part of the game of developing your skill and capacity. So the thing I wanted to share was, the mother did this experiment. She had 3 people she called. To each one she gave 1,000 rupees. And after a day or two, 2 of them gave back the 1,000 to her as an offering. Panditji went back to, he was one of those. Panditji went back to her and gave 2,000 rupees as an offering. And then mother explained. She said, I wanted to see how these people respond to the force that she is putting. It was not just the physical money, the force she put. So she said, there, pointing to those 2, nothing. Here, there was a good response. So it was her way to put a certain energy, a certain intention, and the money did a whole process and came back to her. See, from the ocean it emerges, into the ocean it returns. But when it emerges and returns more complete, having done its work, then it has served the divine. When it just goes out and comes back, it has not served any purpose. So she wanted money to be used, to be applied for growth of the resources. She did not like the idea of people putting money to gain interest. Yeah, to put it in a fixed deposit to gain interest. Because she said then the money is lying unused. Of course, if the bank is applying it as an investment, then you are only investing through the bank. That's a different story. But just to store it to live off interests, she did not like that idea for this reason. That it is meant to be a force in movement for increasing the resources for the divine work. So we come back to this idea of renunciation of the center of egoism, and the means for that, there's the formula of the supreme knowledge, the idea of the oneself in all things, and to realize that, to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that is all that matters. You can take this as an exercise, something you do every day. Every morning before you start your day, if you like, you read these lines, or you just dwell on this idea, visualize, conceive of that idea in all the things of your day, the people, the circumstances, the work you have to do. Infuse that idea into this, and then begin the day. Now you may forget. You won't actively hold this idea later. But the fact that you have infused it, you will find your relationships and your behavior in the day will be changed. And if in the middle of the day, again and again, you are able to remind yourself of this idea, you will find it will more and more actively change. And then again at the end of the day, you may again bring that idea. And if you persist over a few days like this, very quickly, you will find the change palpable. You will no more be so obsessed with your own personal views, personal desires, and personal likes and dislikes. The sense of equality and the sense of freedom from personal attachments will become to be vividly felt, and the rest of the changes will grow. And then especially if you bring in the element of the bhakti, in the sense of serving the divine self and of fulfilling the divine work, it lifts you to a level in the sense of purpose of life. It lifts you to a level that the things which are problems now are so trivial, so small compared to this large, grand purpose. Even you have this sense of the large movement of space and time through eternity, through infinity, this one flow of the divine purpose fulfilling itself, and you are in a part of it. And the problems come, they don't bother you so much because you have a larger vision, a larger purpose for which you're working. So a soldier on the battlefield may get some nicks and cuts. What does it matter? You're fighting with your life. Even if a bullet hits your arm, it didn't kill you. No big problem. right? The same situation in the normal circumstance of life. I got a cut, oh my God, and I make a big drama around it. It's something like that that happens, something so big, so important that all the rest becomes somehow not so important. Yes, everything is important, but problems are not important anymore. And you're able to commit yourself more completely. And it becomes a great joy. It's a small exercise, but it can change things dramatically. And it will be the foundation of the true sense of renunciation that we cultivate.
I don't exactly follow the sentence that action we must do.
So if you add the word even then, that action we must do. So the way the sentence goes, if the realization, fulfillment, service of the oneself demands from us an action, and the rest is parenthetical, that action we must do. That's the sentence. The rest in between is in parenthesis. Action that seems to others self-service, etc., etc. Even then, that action we must do. You see the sentence structure now? If it demands from us an action, that action we must do. That's the full sentence. How to know the demand of the divine. And here the reference he says is the I within is all. Finally, the reference will be inside you, not from what people say or do. All that you can take into account, but what you know deep within. So, first step, you bring this larger picture of the one self that you serve, the divine whom you serve. Second, you put this inner sense of your role in it, your relationship with the divine. And once you have these two in place, it will be obvious what you have to do or not to do, or even how you have to do it. Then, in the specifics of situations, there is a skill of the human capacity, and that is something which will grow in time. But at least you'll have the direction set. So we continue this next Friday, which is the first, and we will start the new year with the example that Sri Aurobindo takes from the Bhagavad Gita. And the criterion, he says, which will be the paragraph after, the criterion is within, as the Gita insists. It is to have the soul free from craving and attachment, but free from attachment to inaction, as well as from the egoistic impulse to action. Free from attachment to the forms of virtue, as well as from the attraction to sin. So it is that freedom from attachment which will be the base. It's a very interesting discussion.